Hello, this is a brief video on writing high-quality survey items. Lots of departments and programs like to use survey items to gather information from students about the quality of their programs. However, it can be deceptively difficult to write high-quality items. In this video, I'm going to give you a quick overview of some tips and techniques to use when writing survey items. My name is Jeremy Penn. I'm the Director of Student Affairs Assessment at North Dakota State University. If you have other questions about writing survey items, or if you're interested in more assessment-related topics in the division, please feel free to contact me at 701-231-5210 or at jeremy.penn@ndsu.edu. So, you think you want to make a survey. Well, to start out, I'd like to give you a quick survey on your interest in making a survey. So, do you want to make a survey? Your options are yes, somewhat agree, 15%, some or all of the above, or please help me. As you can see, it can be really easy to write survey questions, but it's much more difficult to write a very good survey question. And I'm guessing if you're watching this video, you're probably in category E, looking for some help in how to write high-quality items. So as you're thinking about creating a survey, it's important to think about the full survey creation process, starting with identifying your research questions. So that is, what is it you really want to know from your survey? What do you hope to learn? And in particular, are you looking at assessing some particular learning outcomes or program goals? And as you look at that or think about what you're trying to learn from your survey, you may discover a survey may not be the right tool for the job, which is also something to think about. In many cases, there's better tools out there than a survey to gather evidence of student learning and development or operational effectiveness of your program. Another thing to do if you are going to go ahead with a survey is to look around and see what other surveys are available. You may find that there's published surveys available that have addressed a similar topic. So has someone else already done this survey? Or is there something in the campus lab software that you can borrow or use as a way to get yourself some high quality items or a high quality instrument without having to create your own? If you can't find something that exists already, or you can't find someone that's willing to let you use their survey, then think about creating your own questions. So I have some tips on the next slides here. And one thing to think about as you're creating your questions is trying to find time or a plan to try out some of the questions with a focus group or in a pilot study prior to sending out your survey so that you have some good data on what's working or what's not working particularly well. So your key goals for creating high quality items are as follows. You want to develop questions that every respondent in your survey pool will interpret the same way, will be able to respond to accurately, and be willing to answer. If you can get those three things in all of your questions in your survey, you'll be doing pretty well. So the key considerations to think about when you're designing a survey item to meet those three characteristics we looked at on the previous slide are to think about the question format and the structure of the item, the word choice you're using and using complete sentences, the response options you're going to offer to respondents, and avoiding question bias. Then you should also think about how you organize and sort your questions in order and how they're going to be presented on the page or on the website when you're collecting your data. Let's start by taking a look at question format. You have a lot of different options when choosing question formats. One option is to have an open-ended question, such as, tell me about your experience with this program. That can be really helpful and can be insightful in giving you some ideas as to what's happening in a program, and you may get some interesting results from students that you wouldn't get through more close-ended or multiple choice type items. Multiple choice items can be good for a quiz or sort of a pseudo quiz to see what students learned from a discussion or from a presentation. Or you could work with Likert type items where you have a range of responses, for example, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. You could also use check all that apply types of items. But whatever you choose, remember there's implications for data analysis, the length of your survey, and the collection process that you're using. So you have lots of different choices, but you have to think through what the implications are before you choose that as your item type. Next, let's think about the difference between taking deep questions or very broad questions. So here's an example of a very broad question. Which of the following factors was most influential in helping you complete your degree in 4 years? Advisors, living learning community, library, etc. That's a very broad question that covers a wide range of student experiences. When you're writing questions, you can ask very broad questions like this, or you might be interested in asking a very deep question about a particular area. So here's the difference in asking a deep question instead of a broad question. To what extent was your academic advisor helpful in completing your degree in 4 years? So this focuses in on academic advising instead of asking broadly about what programs or services influence their completion. So thinking about that breadth versus depth question is important because do you want to know a lot about a small number of things, or are you hoping to learn a little about a large number of things? So it's important to think about when you're crafting your questions, are you going to cover a broad range of ideas, subjects, or topics, or are you really going to want to dive into something in great depth? When you're crafting your questions, it's also important to use complete sentences and to use simple words that will be understood by a wide range of survey respondents. So here's an example of a very poorly written item stem. The efficacy of this teacher's ability to avoid obfuscation was, that's a very confusing statement, uses very large words, and may not be able to be answered accurately by many of the respondents. Instead, think about a statement like this. The instructor's presentations were clear. It's a complete sentence that uses small words that would be able to be understood very easily by your respondents, and still gets at the point that you're trying to get at with that item. Another important thing to think about when you're designing your items is to use precise, but not overly precise, non-overlapping quantifiers. So let's look at an example. Let's say you're interested in including the respondent's age as one of the questions in your survey. So to be precise, you could ask, please select the category that represents your current age, and we could use minutes as the measure of how old someone is. So you could say more than 26,297,400 minutes old, between 27 million and 10 million minutes old, or less than 8 million minutes old. Now it's a bit of a silly example, but you can see this is excessively precise for the usage we have in mind of using the results for our survey data. Another example, you could just have students respond as categories of age. So are you older than 50? Are you between 39 and 49? Are you less than 30 years old? And again, this would not be a very useful question to ask because most of our students would be under 30 years old, and it wouldn't give you much useful information. And also it's important to think about how your choice of categories will impact your data analysis choices. So if you use just 3 categories like this, you'll be really locked into particular analyses, and you may not get the data or the types of data you want to use in the analysis you have planned. A better option would be to just simply ask students to enter the year they were born. That way it will give you fairly precise and accurate information about their age, and in a way that's fairly non-threatening but still usable on your end of the data analysis. A better option would be to get the information directly from the NDSU student record. So you wouldn't even have to ask the question in your survey, and it can just be added to your file at a later point. So that's another thing to think about as you're developing these questions is, could I get this information somewhere else, allow me to keep the survey very short, but still get all the information I need in my data file so I can analyze and prepare the results that I'm interested in developing. Another issue that comes up commonly in survey questions is double-barreled questions. So for example, to what extent were the employees pleasant and the room temperature comfortable? It's really asking 2 different questions. And if you think about trying to use the results from this question, if somebody said strongly disagree, would you be concerned with the employees or the room temperature? Instead, when this happens, you want to break it into 2 separate questions. So you could ask one question about the employees and one question about the room temperature. That way, the results on both these questions, you can interpret them separately and really understand what's going on. It's also important to use neutral language in your questions. So here's an example of some non-neutral language. I was highly engaged in my classes, or the instructor was excellent. In both cases, you're biasing respondents towards a particular point of view, or leading them on to tend to agree with that result, or to kind of have the expectation that they were engaged in their classes and that the instructor was excellent. Instead, use neutral language like, please state your level of engagement in your classes, or please provide an overall rating for the instructor. In this way, we hope to get non-biased results on our questions that we can really interpret clearly and understand what they're talking about, and not have a particular bent or leaning of our survey. Now that you've thought through what your stems are going to be for your questions, you need to make sure that your response categories align with those stems. Let's take a look at an example. How frequently did you attend class without completing the assigned readings for that day? Strongly agree, agree, do not know, disagree, strongly disagree. In this case, we're asking about frequency in our question, but our response categories are agreement. So that would be very confusing to a respondent to look at this and see, oh, they're asking about frequency, but do I agree with frequency? That doesn't make any sense. Instead, change your response categories so they align with your question. In this case, almost every class about once or twice a week, once about every other week, almost never. So it gives the respondent the chance to think about frequency, which is what we were asking in our question. It's also important to be very careful about where you place the does not apply or neutral categories of your response categories. So if it's really a true does not apply, it should go at the bottom or at the end, so it doesn't appear like it's along the scale of the frequency or agreement that you've put together. If it's a neutral category, that should go in the middle of your scale, but it should be very clear that it's neutral, somewhere in the middle of an agreement scale, and not a does not apply category. In this case, some students may not know what was assigned, so therefore they couldn't appropriately answer this question. So we should make sure we give them that option if it's possible that someone may not know the answer or may not really have that question apply to them. You should also use an equal number of positive and negative categories when you're designing your response categories. So let's look at this response rating for an instructor again. Let's say our categories were excellent, above average, good, or poor. So we have 3 that are really fairly positive and only 1 that's a negative category for your responses. And that's again weighted, and it would tend to have respondents biased towards providing some kind of positive rating. Instead, you should provide a balance between the number of negative and positive categories, so we could change them to excellent, good, mediocre, or poor. So in summary, you really need to think carefully about whether or not respondents have a ready-made, accurate response to your question. Let's look at one more example. The content covered in this course is important to my future career. Seems like a good item at first, but when you start to think about it a little more, you really wonder if respondents would have a ready-made, accurate response to this question. For example, the particular student may not have a future career planned or may have different future career plans from other students in that same class. So they may answer the question in very different ways based on what they're planning on doing with their careers, not based on differences with how they experience the course. They may not all agree on what the content was in the course, so there may be some disagreement on what was the key aspect or the key things that they learned from that course. So again, there may not be accurate responses because they may be responding to different aspects of the course. And it might be hard for them to predict what would be important in the future. So to them, it might be just important to get through the course or get a particular grade in the course, whereas there may be some particular content that would really be important out in a variety of different careers. So again, it's important to think about how different respondents will respond to your questions and whether or not they have an accurate, ready-made response that they're willing to provide to you in your survey. Now that you have your questions written, you need to think about how you're going to organize them into the final survey instrument. Dillman asked this question by asking, would you alphabetize a grocery list? And of course the answer is no. You would instead write down your items based on where they appear in the store. So you'd list all of your produce items together, all of your frozen food items together, all the items in the cereal section together, and so on. And the same thing is true of your survey. It makes most sense for respondents to think about particular groups of questions together. So go ahead and organize your questions in that way. And also you want to think about grouping items together that use a similar response categories, because that makes it much more easy for respondents to answer, and they can answer your survey in a shorter amount of time. You also want to be aware of ordering effects, that the order of your questions doesn't influence how the person answers on the next question. If that might be the case, then you try to randomize the order of questions, or you try to randomize across respondents so that not all respondents get the questions in the same order. But in many cases, that's not the ordering effects are not a big case, or not a big concern for us. You also want to choose the first question carefully, because many respondents will click on your survey and look at that first question and then decide whether or not they want to answer your survey. So make that first question interesting, a question that applies to everyone, and fairly easy in the sense that it's easy to respond to or have an answer for that survey question. Hopefully then that will draw your respondents into your survey and you'll have a better response rate of people completing your survey. And then finally, if you have to ask demographic questions at all, put them at the very end of your survey. And as I mentioned earlier, there's better ways to get this information from some of the data systems we have on campus already. So if you really want that information in your survey, it's usually easiest or best to pull it out of the data systems instead of asking it as part of the survey. So thank you for viewing this video. It was a crash course in designing survey items. I know I covered a lot of topics and a lot of material in a short amount of space. If you'd like to hear more about this topic, or you want me to come visit with your department or with a team that's developing a survey, please don't hesitate to contact me. I look forward to working with you.